How did a quiet, often overlooked queen with no surviving heirs become one of the most influential architects of the modern world? Queen Anne, the last of the Stuart monarchs, isn't the first name that comes to mind when we think of empire, revolution, or global change. And yet, beneath the surface of her reserved personality and turbulent court lay a reign that transformed Britain and by extension, the globe. From uniting two nations into Great Britain, to setting the foundations of parliamentary democracy, to launching the imperial ambitions that shaped centuries, Anne's legacy is all around us. Welcome to Words of Time, where we unravel how the seemingly quiet reign of Queen Anne echoes through today's legal systems, cultural identity, and international politics. Stay with us as we uncover the hidden force behind a monarch who changed the world without needing to conquer it. In the early 18th century, Europe was a continent in flux, racked by dynastic disputes, shifting alliances, and the gradual emergence of modern state structures. Britain, itself still in a transitional state, was navigating a new phase of political, religious, and imperial development. It was within this volatile yet formative context that Queen Anne ascended the throne in 1702. The last of the Stuart monarchs, Anne's reign is often overshadowed by more charismatic or transformative rulers such as Elizabeth I or Queen Victoria. Yet, despite her understated image and personal frailty, Anne's reign marked a turning point in British and European history. It was a period of profound change, during which the foundations of the modern British state, and by extension the modern world, were firmly laid. Anne was born in 1665 into a politically unstable and religiously charged environment. Her father, James II of England and VII of Scotland, was a Catholic monarch in a deeply Protestant nation, and his deposition during the Glorious Revolution of 1688 dramatically altered the line of succession. Anne, a committed Protestant, became the heir after the reign of her sister Mary II and brother-in-law William III. When she took the throne in 1702, Britain was in the early stages of transformation from a collection of loosely connected kingdoms and colonies into a cohesive, centralized empire. Her reign, though relatively short at 12 years, became a crucial period for this transformation. The early 18th century was a time of war and negotiation, intellectual flourishing, and administrative experimentation. Europe was involved in the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict over who would control the vast inheritance of the Spanish Empire. The war would draw in almost all the major powers of Europe and would come to define Anne's foreign policy. On the domestic front, Britain itself was undergoing a dramatic reconfiguration with the Act of Union in 1707, which combined the English and Scottish parliaments into a single kingdom, Great Britain. This political reorganization was not merely symbolic. It marked the beginning of a unified British state that would go on to become one of the world's great imperial powers. To understand Queen Anne's impact, one must look beyond the surface of her reign. Historians have often mischaracterized her as weak, easily manipulated by her advisors and personal companions. While it is true that Anne suffered from chronic health issues and had a limited appetite for political conflict, it is also true that she presided over a period of remarkable achievement. She showed a steady hand in supporting military leaders like the Duke of Marlborough and was instrumental in guiding the nation through one of the most challenging and consequential wars of the period. Moreover, her reign saw the entrenchment of party politics, the evolution of the cabinet system, and the increasing dominance of Parliament over the monarchy, changes that have endured into the present-day functioning of constitutional monarchy and parliamentary democracy. Britain during Anne's time was not merely a political entity, it was also becoming a cultural and intellectual powerhouse. The period witnessed the early stirrings of the Enlightenment, with figures such as Isaac Newton playing central roles in shaping new ways of thinking about science, reason, and governance. Literary giants like Jonathan Swift and Daniel Defoe used the novel and satire to engage with the social and political issues of the day. Queen Anne herself, though not as actively involved in cultural patronage as some monarchs, provided stability and legitimacy to a society in the midst of intellectual ferment. Religiously, Anne's reign was marked by significant efforts to stabilize the Church of England while marginalizing dissenting religious groups. Her firm Protestant faith helped reinforce the identity of the Anglican Church as a pillar of British life, a stance that would influence British religious policy at home and in the colonies for generations. The tension between religious uniformity and toleration, which Anne navigated with varying degrees of success, became a defining characteristic of later British and colonial policies. Queen Anne's failure to produce a surviving heir despite 17 pregnancies had enormous consequences. The lack of a clear Stuart successor led to the 1701 Act of Settlement, which ensured that the throne would pass to a Protestant heir, eventually resulting in the accession of the German House of Hanover in 1714. This dynastic transition, peaceful and legally arranged, stood in stark contrast to the violent successions of the past and helped establish the principle of parliamentary sovereignty over monarchical will. This principle would become a cornerstone not only of British governance but also of democratic systems around the world. Despite all these contributions, Queen Anne remains an underrated figure in popular historical narratives. She is often remembered more for her personal relationships, especially the dramatic falling out with Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, than for her political or constitutional significance. Yet her reign brought about the creation of Great Britain, helped define the constitutional framework still in use today, and solidified the empire's emergence as a global power. These are not trivial legacies. Moreover, the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which concluded the War of the Spanish Succession, marked a new phase in international diplomacy. It curtailed French dominance in Europe, secured key strategic territories for Britain, and laid the groundwork for Britain's 18th and 19th century imperial expansion. The modern world, shaped by balance of power politics, global trade networks, and the rise of liberal constitutionalism, owes much to the outcomes negotiated under Anne's rule. In reassessing her legacy, it becomes clear that Queen Anne was far more than a transitional monarch. Her reign served as a bridge between the absolutist monarchies of the past and the constitutional governments of the modern age. The policies and structures formed during her rule helped shape the modern British state and its global influence. From the unification of the kingdoms to the entrenchment of parliamentary power, from imperial expansion to cultural flourishing, Queen Anne's era laid down many of the political and institutional norms that would guide Britain and by extension many other nations through the centuries that followed. While the grandeur of Elizabeth I and the vast reach of Queen Victoria might command more public attention, the subtle and systemic contributions of Queen Anne's reign are arguably more foundational. Her legacy is not one of flamboyant rule but of essential transformation. In understanding the modern world, its governance structures, international relations and cultural underpinnings, Queen Anne deserves a prominent place in the historical narrative. Anne Stuart was born on February 6, 1665 at St. James's Palace in London, into one of the most turbulent and consequential periods in British royal history. She was the second daughter of James, Duke of York, later James II of England and VII of Scotland, and his first wife, Anne Hyde. The Stuart dynasty, to which Anne belonged, was plagued by religious controversy, dynastic instability, and political strife. The division between Catholicism and Protestantism, deeply entrenched in British society since the Reformation, would come to define much of Anne's personal life and public role. Her life, even from its early stages, was bound tightly to these larger conflicts. As a child, Anne was often in poor health, suffering from eye problems and illnesses that would recur throughout her life. Nevertheless, her early education was typical for royal daughters of the time. She was taught French, music, religious studies, and basic classical education, but not prepared directly for political rule. Her family assumed that male heirs would continue the Stuart line, leaving her in a secondary role within the succession. However, dynastic unpredictability and shifting religious tensions would ultimately propel her toward the throne. Anne's religious upbringing was especially significant. Although her father converted to Catholicism, both Anne and her sister Mary were raised Protestant, following the explicit wishes of their uncle, King Charles II. This decision proved decisive. In the increasingly polarized religious atmosphere of 17th-century England, Protestantism was not just a personal faith but a political necessity, and would become a staunch supporter of the Church of England throughout her life, seeing it as inseparable from the British identity and essential to the stability of the monarchy. The late 17th century was a period marked by the intensification of sectarian tensions. Charles II's reign was marked by suspicions of Catholic sympathies, and when James II, a confirmed Catholic, came to the throne in 1685, these tensions boiled over. James's open support for Catholicism and his attempts to promote religious tolerance for Catholics and dissenters deeply alarmed the Protestant political elite. When James's second wife, Mary of Modena, gave birth to a son in 1688, raising the specter of a Catholic dynasty, parliamentary leaders acted. They invited William of Orange, the Dutch Protestant husband of Anne's elder sister Mary, to invade and claim the throne in what became known as the Glorious Revolution. This bloodless revolution ousted James II and placed William III and Mary II as joint monarchs on the throne in 1689. Anne's position during this period was extremely delicate. Though she supported the Protestant cause and accepted William and Mary's rule, her relationship with her sister Mary became strained. Mary, perhaps viewing Anne as too politically ambitious or overly influenced by court factions, particularly Sarah Churchill, began to limit Anne's access to the court. Anne, who had once been very close to Mary, was deeply hurt by this alienation. The sisters became estranged, and Anne was left isolated even though she remained next in line to the throne under the terms of the new Protestant succession. William III, though successful in consolidating power, faced his own difficulties. He was foreign-born and never fully embraced by the English public. After Mary's death in 1694, William ruled alone, and Anne became his heir apparent. Their relationship was also tense, marked by personal distrust and political competition. William, who favored the Whig Party, was wary of Anne's Tory sympathies and her close ties to figures like Sarah Churchill and the Duke of Marlborough. However, William had no children and accepted Anne's status as the future monarch under the terms set by Parliament. As Anne moved closer to the throne, her role in securing the Protestant succession became increasingly critical. The matter of succession had long troubled the English political establishment. With no surviving children from William and Mary and no acceptable Catholic heirs from James II's line, Parliament passed the Act of Settlement in 1701. This legislation fundamentally reshaped the British monarchy by excluding Catholics from the line of succession and identifying Sophia of Hanover, a granddaughter of James I and a committed Protestant, as the next in line after Anne. The Act also established key constitutional principles, such as the requirement that future monarchs must seek parliamentary consent to go to war or leave the country, effectively limiting royal prerogative. Anne's personal life was marked by tragedy, particularly in her role as a mother. She endured at least 17 pregnancies, but only one child, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, survived infancy, and he died at age 11 in 1700. The grief of losing so many children deeply affected Anne and may have contributed to her physical and emotional fragility later in life. The death of her son also created an immediate crisis of succession, further intensifying the need for the Act of Settlement. It also made Anne's future reign more politically complicated, as it was clear she would be the last Stuart monarch. In 1702, William III died following complications from a fall from his horse. And then, 37 years old, became queen. Her ascension was broadly welcomed across the kingdom. She was seen as the legitimate Protestant heir and a symbol of continuity in the post-revolution settlement. Her deep commitment to the Church of England reassured a population still wary of Catholicism and foreign influence. Her coronation sermon emphasized her religious devotion and framed her rule as divinely sanctioned, in keeping with the prevailing view of monarchy as ordained by God but increasingly accountable to the laws of the land. Though often personally reserved and cautious, Anne was not without political instincts. She was deeply involved in matters of state, particularly in foreign policy and church affairs, and she selected her ministers carefully. She leaned toward the Tory party, whose policies emphasized royal authority, the Anglican Church, and a more cautious approach to war and empire. However, the exigencies of war and political circumstance forced her to rely heavily at times on Whig ministers as well, most notably during the early years of the War of the Spanish Succession. Anne's personal style of governance was shaped by a combination of loyalty to tradition and practical adaptation. Unlike her predecessor William, who had often bypassed English ministers in favor of Dutch advisors, and worked through established English political channels. She respected the authority of Parliament and increasingly deferred to her ministers in day-to-day governance, laying the groundwork for the modern cabinet system. Yet she also sought to maintain personal influence, particularly through her appointments and court patronage. Her long and ultimately fraught relationship with Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, reflected her desire for trusted personal advisors who could also navigate the political landscape. Despite chronic health problems including gout, obesity, and possibly lupus, and maintained a strong sense of royal duty. She presided over one of the most transformative periods in British history, one that saw the creation of the United Kingdom through the 1707 Act of Union, the expansion of British imperial power through victories in war, and the further solidification of constitutional monarchy. Her personal resilience, religious conviction, and political sensibility enabled her to govern effectively in a time of significant transition. In many ways, Anne's rise to power illustrates the gradual shift from medieval notions of monarchy to the more modern conception of constitutional governance. Her position as a female monarch ruling in an age dominated by male politicians and military leaders was significant in itself. While she was constrained by her gender and health, she also showed a shrewd understanding of how to maintain authority within a system increasingly dominated by parliament and party politics. Anne's life and rise to power cannot be understood outside the broader religious and political upheavals of her time. She came to the throne not as a revolutionary or reformer, but as a symbol of continuity, order, and Protestant legitimacy. Her reign marked the culmination of nearly a century of religious wars, dynastic strife, and political experimentation. The careful balance she maintained between tradition and innovation helped stabilize Britain at a crucial moment and set the stage for the empire's expansion in the decades after her death. Though she lacked the dramatic flair of some of her predecessors or successors, Anne's steady leadership and her role in upholding the Protestant and constitutional order make her a monarch of deep and lasting importance in British history. The early 18th century was a time of tremendous political maneuvering and national insecurity in both England and Scotland. Though united under a single monarch since 1603, when James VI of Scotland also became James I of England, the two kingdoms had remained legally and politically distinct. Each maintained its own parliament, legal systems, and religious institutions, even as the crown passed through the same line. This uneasy coexistence, referred to as a personal union, brought with it constant friction over governance, trade, sovereignty, and succession. By the time of Queen Anne's reign, these tensions had reached a boiling point. The Act of Union of 1707, which united England and Scotland into the single kingdom of Great Britain, was not simply the result of a royal desire for unity. It emerged from a complicated web of motivations and fears, economic, political, and strategic, and Queen Anne played a vital role in facilitating and securing this union. The political background to the Union of 1707 lies in the uneasy dynamic that had long existed between the two crowns. England, the more powerful of the two kingdoms, saw Scotland as both a potential ally and a potential threat. Throughout the 17th century, Scottish politics had often been turbulent, with religious uprisings, shifting alliances, and deep economic distress. From the English perspective, an independent Scotland could act as a staging ground for foreign invasions, especially from Catholic powers like France, who might use Scotland's long-standing grievances against England as leverage. The English government also feared that Scotland might choose a different successor after Queen Anne, threatening the fragile Protestant succession secured by the 1701 Act of Settlement. From the Scottish side, there was growing resentment at being treated as a junior partner in a dynastic arrangement dominated by English interests. The Scottish economy had suffered immensely during the 1690s, with a series of failed harvests, banking crises, and the disastrous Darien scheme, a colonial expedition to Panama meant to establish Scotland as an imperial power. The failure of this scheme, exacerbated by English opposition and lack of support, left Scotland financially crippled and politically embittered. When the English Parliament passed the Alien Act of 1705, threatening to cut off trade and treat Scots as foreigners unless they agreed to union, Scotland's political class found itself in a position of limited options. It was in this context of mutual distrust, strategic necessity, and economic coercion that negotiations for union began. Queen Anne, as a monarch with strong ties to both countries and a deep concern for the Protestant succession, became a central figure in pushing the process forward. Though constrained by parliamentary power, she consistently supported unification efforts and used her influence to encourage cooperation. She understood that a union would solidify Protestantism, protect the crown from dynastic disputes, and create a stronger geopolitical entity capable of competing with France and other European powers. The actual process of passing the Act of Union was complex and controversial. Both parliaments needed to approve the treaty, and resistance came from various factions. In Scotland, there was significant popular opposition to the union, with protests erupting in Edinburgh and other cities. Many Scots feared the loss of national sovereignty and the dominance of English interests. The Scottish Parliament, however, was more pliable, in part because many of its members stood to gain financially or politically from the union. Bribes, patronage, and promises of economic compensation played a large role in securing votes. The English government offered the equivalent of financial settlement meant to offset Scotland's assumption of a share in England's national debt, which helped win over skeptical lawmakers. In 1706, commissioners from both kingdoms finalized the terms of union, and by May 1, 1707, the two countries became one, the Kingdom of Great Britain. Queen Anne opened the first Parliament of Great Britain with a speech that hailed the union as the greatest instance of wisdom and public spirit which hath ever appeared in any age or nation. She emphasized the hope that it would end animosities, consolidate national strength, and preserve civil and religious liberties. Her leadership was essential in navigating the volatile politics of both realms and ensuring the success of the measure. The Act of Union had profound and immediate effects on governance. It dissolved the separate English and Scottish parliaments and created a single unified parliament at Westminster. Scotland retained its distinct legal and religious systems, but political decisions would now be made collectively. This centralization of legislative authority laid the groundwork for a modern British state, even as it introduced new complexities and inequalities. While England had the numerical advantage in the new parliament, Scotland gained access to the vast markets of the English Empire, an incentive that would eventually transform its economy and society. In the short term, the union was not universally embraced. In Scotland, resentment lingered, and many viewed the agreement as a betrayal by the political elite. Riots and protests continued for years. In England, too, there were mixed feelings, with some wary of incorporating a poorer, restive neighbor with different customs and laws. Nevertheless, the strategic and economic benefits of union quickly became apparent. The shared resources of both kingdoms enabled Britain to field larger armies, expand its navy, and participate more effectively in the global struggle for empire. In the longer term, the Act of Union contributed significantly to the formation of a distinct British identity. While regional and national identities remained strong, the concept of Britain as a political and cultural unit began to take shape. This identity was reinforced by shared participation in wars, commerce, scientific advancements, and religious reform. The 18th century saw the rise of a British sense of destiny tied to Protestantism, liberty, commerce, and empire that would influence the national psyche for generations. Symbols like the Union Jack, common currency, and imperial ambitions helped solidify this emerging identity, even as tensions occasionally flared between the constituent nations. One of the more subtle outcomes of the Union was its impact on political philosophy and constitutional development. The creation of a larger political entity required new ways of thinking about representation, law, and governance. Ideas about sovereignty, citizenship, and rights evolved in tandem with the institutional changes brought about by union. British constitutionalism, already shaped by the Glorious Revolution, began to take on a more composite character, accommodating different traditions under a single legal political framework. This model, though imperfect and often contested, would later influence other constitutional systems around the world. The Union also played a key role in the development of the British Empire. By pooling the resources and manpower of England and Scotland, Britain was better equipped to expand its colonial footprint. Scottish administrators, soldiers, and merchants became central players in imperial ventures from India to the Caribbean. The global ambitions of the British state after 1707 cannot be separated from the structural consolidation enabled by union. The economic integration of the two kingdoms, combined with a unified foreign policy, allowed Britain to pursue imperial dominance with greater coherence and effectiveness. Over the centuries, the legacy of the 1707 Union has continued to shape the United Kingdom and its relationship with the wider world. In the Commonwealth nations Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and others, the British model of parliamentary democracy, legal pluralism, and cultural integration owes much to the formative union between England and Scotland. These countries inherited not only institutions and governance structures, but also the underlying philosophy of negotiated union and shared sovereignty. The idea that diverse communities could coexist within a single constitutional framework was a direct inheritance of Queen Anne's era. Yet, the legacy of the Act of Union has not been without its challenges. In recent decades, political movements in Scotland have called for greater autonomy or outright independence. The 1998 devolution settlement restored a degree of legislative authority to Scotland, and the 2014 independence referendum, though ultimately rejecting separation, revived questions about the long-term viability of the Union. The political reconfigurations following Brexit, in which Scotland voted to remain in the European Union while England and Wales voted to leave, have further strained the cohesion of the United Kingdom. Even so, the endurance of the 1707 Union is a testament to its foundational strength. What began as a politically driven and economically motivated agreement has evolved into a complex, multifaceted polity that continues to shape modern political discourse. Queen Anne's commitment to union, both as a stabilizing mechanism and a tool for strengthening the monarchy and the Protestant state, proved to be prescient. Her willingness to support the controversial but necessary compromises of the time enabled the emergence of a more resilient and adaptive British state. The Act of Union of 1707 marked a watershed moment in British and global history. Born out of necessity, engineered through political negotiation and economic incentives, and shepherded by a monarch with both vision and caution, the Union transformed two historically distinct kingdoms into a single, more powerful entity. Its effects were immediate centralized governance, economic integration, and greater military strength, but its deeper legacy unfolded over generations. The formation of a British identity, the creation of a model for constitutional union, and the launching of an imperial project that would span the globe. Queen Anne's role, often underestimated, was instrumental in navigating this fraught and pivotal chapter, leaving a legacy that continues to resonate in the political, cultural, and institutional fabric of the modern United Kingdom and its former colonies. In 1700, when the childless Charles II of Spain died, he named Philip, Duke of Anjou and grandson of Louis XIV of France, as his heir. This arrangement threatened to unite France and Spain under a single Bourbon monarch, upending the balance of power in Europe. Alarmed, England, soon to be Great Britain, the Dutch Republic and the Holy Roman Empire formed the Grand Alliance in 1701 to oppose this consolidation of Bourbon dominance. England, under Queen Anne's recently solidified authority, took a leading role in opposing French-Spanish ascendancy, commissioning the Great Alliance of 1701 with the aim of preserving Protestant succession and European equilibrium. The war erupted across Europe in 1702, but also spread to colonial domains where England's North American colonies engaged in fierce contests with France under the banner of what came to be called Queen Anne's War in the Colonies. Battlegrounds spanned Europe, North America, and the high seas. On the European front, the Allied generals John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, and Prince Eugene of Savoy led a brilliant campaign marked by several major victories. Marlborough's leadership would become legendary, laying the groundwork for Britain's rise to parity with continental powers. The first major confrontation came in 1704 at Blenheim, where Marlborough and Eugene halted France's advance toward Vienna. The victory sent shockwaves across Europe, ensuring Bavaria's exit from the war and boosting Allied morale. Momentum continued in the Low Countries. At Ramillies in May 1706, Marlborough again outmaneuvered the French, decisively routing Marshal Villeroy's forces and securing control of most of the Spanish Netherlands. This was followed by victory at Oude-Inard, which further weakened French resolve and allowed the siege of Lille. Yet no triumph came without cost. At Malplaquet in 1709, victory was Pyrrhic. Immense casualties, nearly 2 Allied deaths for every French casualty, shocked Britain and fueled war weariness at home. On the colonial stage, British forces also gained ground. The capture of Port Royal in 1710 seized Acadia, present-day Nova Scotia, and in North America, earlier successes included the takeover of Hudson Bay Territory and Newfoundland under the Peace of Utrecht. Although France retained strongholds like Isle Royale, Cape Breton, and parts of St. Pierre and Miquelon, its grip on North America weakened considerably. As success mounted, domestic pressure mounted for peace. The Tory administration, ascendant in 1711, sought to end the protracted conflict. Queen Anne supported this shift in policy, recognizing the economic and social strain the war had placed on her realm. Negotiations culminated in the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. Under the Treaties of Utrecht, Britain secured several key gains. Gibraltar and Minorca were ceded by Spain, providing strategic Mediterranean naval bases. Nations also reached valuable commercial concessions in Spanish America, expanding British mercantile reach. In North America, France officially relinquished Newfoundland and its claims to the Hudson Bay area, compensating the Hudson's Bay Company for wartime losses. France also ceded Acadia to Britain, although retained fishing rights in parts of Newfoundland. Thus, Britain assumed sovereignty over Canada's eastern mainland and significantly expanded its Atlantic domain. Beyond territory, Utrecht formalized the concept of a balance of power in Europe. The treaty prohibited any union of the French and Spanish crowns, a strategically crucial limitation on Bourbon expansion. It also required France to cease supporting the Jacobite claimants to the British throne, fortifying the Protestant succession and consolidating Anne's legacy. These territorial and political settlements fundamentally shifted global power toward Britain. Gibraltar and Minorca gave Britain Mediterranean naval access, strengthening its navy's freedom of movement. In the Atlantic and North America, control of strategic colonies marked a critical expansion of empire. Economically, access to Spanish markets and the fur and fishing industries transformed Britain into the preeminent Atlantic mercantile power. Moreover, the effective financing of the war demonstrated British fiscal ingenuity by innovating in public debt and taxation. Britain sustained its war machine and laid the foundation for long-term imperial investment, while France emerged deeply indebted. These changes had sweeping long-term consequences. Britain now possessed a vast maritime empire, facilitating global trade and naval expansion. The Royal Navy's capacity grew exponentially, leading to maritime dominance throughout the 18th century. Meanwhile, France's economy struggled to keep pace, signaling the decline of French hegemony. Spain's colonial empire also weakened structurally, leading to its eventual decline in global importance. Politically, the war and its resolution under Queen Anne helped entrench parliamentary influence over monarchy. The shift toward peace by a popularly elected Tory parliament rather than royal diktat reflected an evolving constitutional dynamic. Anne's agreement to foreign policy shaped by parliament entrenched cabinet governance, steering Britain toward modern parliamentary democracy. Additionally, the Protestant settlement fortified that religious political settlement that would guide British monarchy for centuries. Culturally and ideologically, the triumph became central to British national identity celebrated through Marlborough's victories, Addison's odes and military pageantry. It fostered an imperial mindset of destiny and global mission that defined 18th-century Britain. In colonial societies, these outcomes had profound effects. Britain's control of North American territories laid foundations for future settlement patterns and the colonies' integration under British institutional systems. Although tensions arose, the legal, linguistic and governmental systems established across Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and the Hudson Bay region shaped the trajectory of Canada and the eastern United States. In the Caribbean, control of St. Kitts and other holdings broadened Britain's sugar empire, planting seeds for slave-based plantation economies. Within Europe, the peace also shifted geopolitical alliances. France resumed military and economic recovery, but the establishment of Britain's naval supremacy left the French navy comparatively neglected. The Austrians strengthened positions in Italy and the Low Countries, rounding out a continental power distribution centered on Britain and Austria. Britain's prominence in continental diplomacy grew, leading to later alliances such as those at Vienna and Hanover. France's recognition of the Hanoverian succession reduced the likelihood of Catholic Jacobites reclaiming the throne. When Anne died in 1714, George I succeeded without major upheaval thanks in large part to settlements achieved under the treaties initiated at Utrecht. The War of the Spanish Succession was a transformational chapter in British history. Its causes were rooted in dynastic struggle and strategic rivalry. Its theaters spanned both old and new worlds. Anne's alliance-building and support for martial and diplomatic leaders laid the groundwork. Military victories under Marlborough shattered French ambitions, while the Treaty of Utrecht solidified gains that reshaped British imperial architecture, maritime supremacy and constitutional governance. These moves vaulted Britain into global preeminence in industrial, colonial, naval, and financial status that would define its role across the following 2 centuries and leave an enduring legacy on modern geopolitics. The early 18th century saw a profound transformation in British governance, as the locus of political power shifted decisively from the monarch to parliament, laying the foundations for the modern British constitution. This era witnessed the rise of parliamentary sovereignty through a combination of political necessity, institutional innovation and evolving ideology. Although the Queen retained formal authority, the actual direction of government increasingly rested with Parliament and its emerging parties, cementing norms and structures that underpin democracy in Britain today. At the dawn of Anne's reign, the monarchy was still a potent institution, and royal prerogatives over appointments, foreign policy, and war were deeply influential. Yet Parliament's victory in the Glorious Revolution of 1688 had already laid the groundwork for parliamentary supremacy, and ascended the throne in a context where the Bill of Rights and the Act of Settlement had clearly circumscribed royal authority. These statutes codified Parliament's dominance by ensuring the monarch ruled with its support. Nonetheless, Anne remained a central political figure governing alongside advisors, issuing royal patents and influencing policy through patronage. Her role, however, increasingly became one of selecting ministers who commanded the confidence of Parliament rather than exercising unilateral power. A key driver of the monarch-to-Parliament shift was the reciprocal struggle between Whig and Tory factions. Though party identity remained fluid, Whigs generally endorsed commercial expansion, religious toleration and closer parliamentary oversight, while Tories emphasized the Anglican Church, landed interests and traditional royal prerogatives. The competition between these factions heightened during Anne's reign, with each seeking to dominate political appointments, legislation and war policy. Parliament's growing confidence in steering national affairs during wartime, alongside the institutionalization of party mechanisms, steadily eroded the Queen's unilateral influence. Into this competitive and evolving landscape stepped figures like Sidney Godolphin and Robert Harley, whose political ingenuity and leadership helped navigate Britain's changing governance. Godolphin, a Tory yet broadly pragmatic and willing to work across factions, served as Lord High Treasurer from 1702 to 1710. He played a crucial role in financing the War of the Spanish Succession through innovations in public credit and taxation, making the government's functioning increasingly contingent on parliamentary approval of funds. This reliance significantly strengthened Parliament's hand, since without its consent the administrative apparatus and with it, the monarchy would flounder. Robert Harley, whose rise exemplifies the crown-dependent minister, became Speaker of the House of Commons in 1705, later serving as Queen's Secretary and then Chief Minister. His political deftness lay in balancing party pressures, managing patronage and negotiating policy consensus. Harley's ascendancy signaled the rise of cabinet-based executive leadership. The cabinet was an informal selection of ministers capable of maintaining parliamentary confidence and discharging collective decision-making. This prototype of cabinet government gradually supplanted royal councils and ad hoc committees, institutionalizing a system in which ministers, not the monarch alone, governed. Parliament's power was further consolidated during the prolonged War of the Spanish Succession. Funding the war required extensive parliamentary cooperation, eroding monarchical autonomy in military affairs. Taxation acts, subsidy bills, and war appropriations became vehicles of influence, compelling ministers to negotiate with MPs. Parliament met annually, debated foreign policy, scrutinized public expenditure, and even challenged confidential prerogatives. The Queen's influence diminished as ministers spoke for the Crown in public forums and shaped policy through parliamentary majorities. A particularly significant moment occurred around 1710, when Anne's favor shifted from Whig to Tory leadership. With the public weary of war and scandal, Tories led by Harley and St. John capitalized on discontent to swell their parliamentary majority. Under Anne's guidance, Harley was elevated to Earl of Oxford and Lord Treasurer. While the Queen's endorsement was vital, the real engine was parliamentary majority. Harley's power derived largely from his party's ability to pass legislation and fund government. This dynamic underscored the centrality of Parliament in determining governance. Even so, Anne retained the prerogative to dissolve Parliament and call elections, tools she used selectively to bolster her political position but always in consultation with parliamentary leaders. The dual emergence of party politics and cabinet government represented a constitutional turning point. Though parties remained loosely organized, they provided coherence and discipline in Parliament, making it easier for ministers to gather support. Cabinet government evolved as these parliamentary factions coalesced around ministers with royal authority. The cabinet, accountable to Parliament rather than the monarch alone, formalized collective responsibility, a hallmark of modern governance. The Queen, while still exercising influence through appointments and patronage, became increasingly constrained by the need to appoint ministers who could maintain parliamentary support. At the same time, institutional frameworks took root that reinforced Parliament's primacy. Regular sessions, standing committees, the annual budget cycle, and motion procedures created a robust and enduring parliamentary process. The emergence of parliamentary privilege protecting free speech and initiative of MPs enabled legislative scrutiny and policy formation independent of royal approval. These practices, though embryonic in Anne's time, would evolve into the parliamentary architecture of 19th and 20th century Britain. Queen Anne's waning political influence was not abrupt, but gradual, a product of conventions and political necessity. She demonstrated willingness to defer, notably in allowing her ministers to negotiate the Treaty of Utrecht with France, even where Parliament held mixed views. Treaty negotiations were led by Harley and Bolingbroke, with Anne's role largely ceremonial. Anne's acceptance of parliamentary-led foreign policy marked a departure from royal autonomy and a shift toward constitutional conservatism. The transformation of royal power was also visible in the judiciary and legal framework. The 1711 Succession Act, for instance, reaffirmed the Act of Settlements principles and affirmed parliamentary jurisdiction over succession, a clear limit on monarchical discretion. Similarly, legal challenges to the administration, such as cases involving the validity of high office actions, were increasingly judged by courts empowered by parliamentary statutes, not merely royal prerogatives. Queen Anne's death catalyzed a litmus test for parliamentary supremacy. With no surviving heirs, the choice of the Protestant House of Hanover as her successor was first determined by the Act of Settlement. The succession of George I, despite his linguistic and cultural distance, proceeded peacefully, underscoring that parliamentary arrangements now dictated sovereignty. The monarch's role had become symbolic, subject to lawful constraints, and reliant on ministerial harmony with Parliament. The longer-term implications for British democracy were profound. The institutional shift during Anne's reign established key tenets: Parliament as chief lawmaker, Cabinet as executive accountable to the House of Commons, party politics structuring governance, state finance controlled by elected representatives, and judiciary operating under parliamentary statutes. These elements became foundational to parliamentary democracy and were emulated in British colonies and later Commonwealth nations. In North America, the movement toward representative governance and resistance to executive authority echoed these British developments. Colonial legislatures drew inspiration from the British model, controlling taxes, impeaching officials, and challenging royal governors. Even after independence, the new American republics embedded these principles within their constitutions. Within Britain, the constitutional settlement achieved permanence in political culture. The Reform Acts of the 19th century expanded representation within the parliamentary model originally shaped under Anne. The monarch's role continued its ceremonial evolution, with Queen Victoria and her successors presiding over governments led by party-based cabinets. The conventions of ministerial accountability and parliamentary control over governance became entrenched expectations, defining British political life to this day. Queen Anne's reign, therefore, marks a pivotal moment when formal monarchy began its transformation into constitutional monarchy. By aligning royal authority with parliamentary will through careful selection of ministers, acceptance of parliamentary supremacy, and support for party-based governance, and shepherded a working system that combined tradition with constitutional innovation. The structures and norms crystallized during her reign became the sinews of modern British constitutionalism, the fusion of monarchy and parliamentary democracy. It is remarkable that this architectural transformation occurred under a monarch often seen as tutored by advisor and lacking in decisiveness. Yet it is precisely Anne's willingness to accommodate changing political realities, exemplified by her dealings with Parliament, support for key ministers, and acceptance of cabinet government, that legitimized and solidified the evolving constitutional order. By the end of her reign, Britain had a functioning system in which the monarch offered stability and continuity while real power resided in Parliament and its executive, answering to the electorate and shaped by party allegiance. The rise of parliamentary power during Queen Anne's reign was no accident but the result of legal innovation, war-driven necessity, institutional adaptation, and political evolution. The Queen's role shifted from active ruler to constitutional figurehead, while ministers and Parliament inherited the levers of governance. The period laid the groundwork for representative democracy, cabinet responsibility, party competition, and parliamentary oversight, making Anne's reign a defining chapter in the emergence of Britain's modern political system. During Queen Anne's reign, religion remained a deeply entrenched and volatile force in British political and social life. The late 17th and early 18th centuries were characterized by efforts to forge a stable Protestant identity while managing a nation still grappling with the aftermath of the Reformation, the Civil Wars, and the Glorious Revolution. Religion was not simply a matter of personal conscience, it was tied to loyalty, legitimacy, and the very structure of governance. Queen Anne, herself a devout Anglican with a personal commitment to the Church of England, presided over a period when the religious settlement that had defined the post-1688 order was both solidified and contested. Her reign saw attempts to suppress dissent, reassert Anglican dominance, and manage the uneasy balance among Anglicans, dissenters, and Catholics. These efforts left a lasting mark on church-state relations in both Britain and the wider empire. The Church of England, as the established church, was central to the political identity of the nation. Anne's personal piety and her deep attachment to Anglicanism made her a strong proponent of the Church's privileges and doctrines. She saw the Church as a pillar of stability and viewed any challenge to its authority as a potential threat to the unity of the realm. Throughout her reign, she supported legislation that reinforced Anglican supremacy and limited the influence of religious minorities, especially Protestant dissenters who had previously benefited from some degree of tolerance, and regularly attended services, encouraged high church appointments among bishops, and played an active role in the ecclesiastical patronage system. Under her guidance, Anglicanism was not just preserved, it was promoted as a central component of national identity and governance. The two most significant legislative expressions of this stance were the Occasional Conformity Act of 1711 and the Schism Act of 1714. These acts aimed at curbing the influence of dissenters, those Protestants who had broken away from the Church of England, such as Presbyterians, Baptists, and Congregationalists, by limiting their ability to participate in public life. The Occasional Conformity Act targeted the practice whereby dissenters would occasionally take Anglican communion to qualify for public office, despite their actual religious beliefs diverging from Anglican doctrine. The act made this kind of strategic conformity illegal, thus closing off access to office for many dissenters. The Schism Act went further, attempting to restrict the ability of dissenters to operate schools or teach, unless they were licensed by a bishop and took Anglican communion. Together, these laws represented a clampdown on religious pluralism and an effort to consolidate Anglican political and cultural dominance. These measures were driven in part by Tory ideology, which closely aligned with the High Church Anglican position and feared that dissenters were gaining undue influence through their ties to the Whigs. Tories believed that loosening restrictions on religious minorities would undermine national cohesion and introduce instability. The High Church Anglicans especially regarded dissenters as a threat to ecclesiastical order, while continuing to regard Catholics as disloyal and tied to foreign powers. For many in Queen Anne's government, preserving Anglican uniformity was seen as a way of ensuring political stability and national security. These legislative actions, while temporarily successful in limiting dissenters' rights, also revealed the fragility of religious unity and the tensions embedded in England's confessional state. Despite Anne's clear commitment to the Anglican establishment, her reign did not bring an end to religious tensions in Britain. Catholicism, while increasingly marginalized, remained a politically charged issue. The Glorious Revolution had already barred Catholics from the throne, and the Act of Settlement had formalized this prohibition, making Protestant succession a matter of national security. Throughout Anne's reign, suspicion of Catholics persisted, with periodic fears of Jacobite uprisings and foreign plots. Although there was no major Catholic rebellion during her reign, anti-Catholic sentiment remained a persistent undercurrent, shaping policy and public discourse. Meanwhile, Protestant dissenters, despite their marginalization under the law, continued to exert cultural and economic influence, particularly in urban centers. Many dissenters were active in commerce, education, and publishing. Their exclusion from public office did not prevent them from participating in broader civil society, and their ideas contributed significantly to debates about religious tolerance, individual conscience, and civic rights. Tensions between the established church and the dissenting communities were not merely theological, they reflected broader concerns about who had access to power, influence, and national identity. The religious policies of Anne's reign also had consequences beyond England and Scotland. In the colonies, especially in North America, the church-state relationship established under her rule helped shape the early religious frameworks of British America. The Anglican Church was officially established in several colonies, including Virginia and the Carolinas, and enjoyed the patronage of the Crown. However, the realities of colonial life marked by diversity, distance, and a spirit of local autonomy often made rigid enforcement difficult. In practice, many colonies tolerated a range of Protestant expressions, and dissenters often established thriving congregations and educational institutions despite official preferences for Anglicanism. Nevertheless, the influence of Anne's religious policy was felt in the form of governors appointed by the Crown who supported Anglican dominance, and through imperial policies that often mirrored the mother country's suspicion of religious heterodoxy. The legacy of Queen Anne's religious settlement is complex. On one hand, her reign entrenched the Church of England's central role in national life, bolstered by legislation and royal patronage. Her support for the occasional conformity and schism acts represented a decisive effort to suppress alternative Protestant voices and maintain a cohesive religious identity aligned with Tory and Royalist principles. On the other hand, these very efforts exposed the limits of enforced religious uniformity and contributed to growing calls for religious tolerance in the decades that followed. Many of the restrictions imposed during Anne's reign were later repealed or fell into disuse, as Enlightenment ideas and changing social realities made religious pluralism more acceptable and politically feasible. Moreover, Anne's reign helped institutionalize the intertwining of church and state in British governance, a relationship that would continue to define the British constitutional order well into the 19th and 20th centuries. The monarch's role as supreme governor of the Church of England, the presence of bishops in the House of Lords, and the continued establishment of the Anglican Church in England can all be traced back to this period of consolidation. At the same time, the dissenting tradition and its resistance to state control would lay the groundwork for later movements advocating religious liberty, civil rights, and eventually the separation of church and state in many contexts, including in countries like the United States. Queen Anne's approach to religion reflected both her personal convictions and the political realities of her time. She ruled in an age when religious identity was inseparable from political allegiance, and her policies were shaped by the need to preserve order and unity in a still fractured kingdom. While her efforts succeeded in strengthening the Anglican establishment in the short term, They also underscored the persistent divisions and the gradual shift toward greater tolerance that would follow in the Enlightenment and beyond. Her legacy in matters of religion is thus one of both consolidation and transition, deeply rooted in the past, yet pointing toward the modern world's more pluralistic and inclusive approaches to faith and governance. During Anne's reign, a vibrant fusion of artistry, scientific inquiry, and institutional innovation transformed Britain's cultural landscape, laying the groundwork for a modern Western identity grounded in reason, creativity, and national pride. Queen Anne's patronage provided vital support for literature, architecture, music, science, and the institutions that nurtured them, impacting not just her own era but generations that followed. Anne, though modest and understated, demonstrated her appreciation for the arts through patronage of leading literary figures such as Jonathan Swift and Daniel Defoe. Swift's A Tale of a Tub and later Gulliver's Travels brought biting satire and moral reflection into public discourse. Even before Simpson's appointment as dean, Anne's support for a literary milieu enabled Swift's influence to extend beyond Ireland into London's salons. Defoe, a pioneer of the modern novel, published Robinson Crusoe at the tail end of Anne's reign, but his earlier journalistic work, including the Review, reflected the period's appetite for serialized commentary and public debate. Both Swift and Defoe exemplified Anne's era, the so-called Augustan literary age, where wit, moral critique, and clarity of expression defined a burgeoning national literature. Architecturally, the Queen Anne style, although more strictly associated with slightly later movements, traces its roots to early 18th century preferences for symmetry, classical influence, and quality craftsmanship. Even if major commissions were limited under her reign, Anne's patronage of building projects and her preference for refined facades and balanced proportions helped influence domestic architecture across England. Musically, Anne had a personal appreciation for the arts. She maintained a beautiful private voice, frequently performing in court concerts, and encouraged the establishment of English opera houses. Though the Royal Academy of Music was formally founded in 1822, its antecedents, including Anne's courtly musical gatherings, fostered an appetite for musical excellence that rippled into the mid-18th century. The intellectual rise of Enlightenment thinking across Britain wasn't incidental. It was a cultural movement empowered by both royal and civic support. Central was the elevation of reason and empirical inquiry, a worldview crystallized by Sir Isaac Newton. Dubbed by Anne in 1705 and serving as Master of the Mint and President of the Royal Society beginning in 1703, Newton personified the era's spirit. His Principia redefined scientific paradigms and framed the natural world as orderly and knowable. His later work Optics continued that legacy. Newton's stewardship at the Mint, improving coinage and financial stability, paralleled the expansion of public credit and fiscal management under and an alignment of science, economy, and governance. Queen Anne's reign also coincided with the growth of scientific societies and learned institutions, including philanthropy-driven groups such as the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge. These bodies reflected a belief in using empirical knowledge and moral purpose to improve society, commerce, religion, and public welfare, key Enlightenment ambitions. Anne's cultural and scientific patronage also influenced British identity and later Western civilization. The architecture of domestic buildings, balanced, classical, harmonious, corresponded with the national self-image of balance, stability, and refined civility. The success of periodicals and novels helped forge a literate, socially conscious middle class whose values reason, moderation, public-mindedness would guide political reform and civic culture in the centuries ahead. Newton's scientific authority became an emblem for what British reason could achieve, scientific breakthroughs corroborating Britain's status as an intellectual and imperial power. His role at the Mint also connected science with statecraft, presaging how empirical rigor would inform modern financial administration. The legacy of writers like Swift and Defoe had longer arcs, influencing political satire, journalism, and the novel. Swift's political pamphleteering and moralistic satire would resonate through later British and American political discourse. Defoe's innovative fictional realism in Robinson Crusoe created a genre that remains influential in Western literature. Periodical culture, initiated under Anne, continued to support public debate and practical morality. The Spectator shaped the ethos of polite society, influencing education and conduct into the Victorian age. The ethos of reason would eventually animate the push for political reforms such as the Reform Acts extending the franchise, the rise of mass education, and late 18th century reformist movements. Musically, Anne's courtly patronage prefigured the flowering of English oratorio via Handel, though his fame postdated her reign. The social precedents set by her support for music elevated the arts within public consciousness. Institutionally, The model of government endorsement of learning and culture during Anne's era persisted. The Royal Society's ongoing prominence, later models like the British Museum, and global institutions in the British Empire all mirrored her synthesis of state and scholarship. In former colonies, Enlightenment values, periodical culture, parliamentary systems, and scientific societies became foundational to new national identities, manifestations of the cultural frameworks seeded in Anne's reign. Queen Anne's support and stabilization of arts and sciences, paired with the rise of public institutions and intellectual exchange, established a durable foundation for modern Western culture. The partnerships between Crown, society, and scholarship underpinned the Enlightenment, strengthening national identity around reason, civility, and progress. From Swift's satirical lampoon to Newton's universal laws, from classical brick houses to bustling coffee houses, Anne's reign fostered the institutions and talents that would define Britain's global influence and cultural legacy. Queen Anne's reign presents a compelling study of gender and authority in a time when power was overwhelmingly viewed as the preserve of men. As a female monarch navigating a patriarchal society, Anne had to assert authority not just politically but symbolically, projecting strength, stability, and legitimacy while contending with assumptions about a woman's capacity to govern. Her reign demonstrated that queenship could hold its own in shaping national policy, managing war, and steering cultural identity. Yet Anne's experience also underscored the personal complexities and constraints faced by women in leadership, particularly when court politics and gender expectations collided. When Anne ascended the throne, the notion of a ruling queen was no longer entirely novel. Elizabeth I and Mary II had reigned before her, but female sovereignty remained an exception that demanded careful management of image and influence. Anne had to be both monarch and woman, balancing authority with propriety. Her public persona emphasized piety, duty, and devotion to the Church of England, framing her leadership within the accepted moral codes of the era. In this way, Anne subtly reinforced her legitimacy. By presenting herself as a moral and maternal figurehead, she avoided the perception of overstepping the traditional boundaries of female conduct while exercising real power. Despite these efforts, her queenship was continually shaped by the people around her, and few relationships defined her reign as powerfully as those with Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, and later Abigail Masham. Sarah Churchill, Anne's childhood friend, became not only a close confidant but also a political ally and advisor, holding significant sway in early years of the reign. Sarah's husband, John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, was the commanding general of British forces in the War of the Spanish Succession and a critical figure in the military successes of the time. Sarah's influence extended beyond the personal. She was deeply involved in court appointments, political lobbying, and even foreign policy discussions. However, the intimacy between Anne and Sarah eventually soured, driven by Sarah's increasingly forceful behavior, political disagreements, and Anne's desire for emotional privacy. Sarah's candid and at times domineering style clashed with Anne's more reserved and introspective nature. Their correspondence reveals a complex emotional bond, sometimes affectionate and at other times strained by expectations and resentments. As their relationship deteriorated, Anne's reliance shifted to Abigail Masham, a cousin of Sarah's and a more discreet, less politically assertive companion. Abigail Masham's rise alarmed Sarah and her political allies, particularly the Whigs, who saw Abigail as aligned with Tory interests. Unlike Sarah, Abigail eschewed overt political engagement, but her influence on Anne's court was undeniable. In private, Abigail provided the emotional support Anne craved, while in public her presence signaled a realignment of political sympathies at court. The shift contributed to the Marlboroughs' fall from favor and the eventual ascendancy of the Tories late in Anne's reign. This court drama became emblematic of how queenship could be filtered through the personal relationships of the monarch, leading contemporaries and later historians to scrutinize female rule not just in terms of policy, but in emotional and psychological terms. These court dynamics were often sensationalized, with some critics accusing and of allowing sentiment to cloud judgment. The notion that private affections could guide public policy seemed especially troubling when the sovereign was a woman, reinforcing gendered stereotypes that women were governed by emotion rather than reason. Pamphlets and political commentary from the era often cast Anne as overly dependent, too soft-hearted, or easily manipulated by her favorites. Yet this critique ignored the strategic calculations Anne made as ruler. Her shift from the Whigs to the Tories, her distancing from the Churchill faction, and her handling of court appointments all reflected a sovereign asserting her own priorities and consolidating authority in the manner available to her within gendered constraints. In this sense, Anne's reign challenges assumptions about female passivity in governance. Though her rule lacked the flamboyant assertiveness of Elizabeth I, and was neither a puppet nor a figurehead, she managed to maintain control of the political direction of her court even while navigating the highly male-dominated structures of parliament and the military. Her reign oversaw landmark developments: the Act of Union, victories in the War of the Spanish Succession, the strengthening of the Anglican establishment, and the foundations of Britain's global empire. All occurred under her watch and with her active participation, even if much of the execution was carried out by male ministers and generals. Anne's leadership thus left a significant legacy in shaping the perception of women in power. Her reign normalized the presence of a reigning queen in the constitutional framework of Britain. By the end of her time on the throne, the British public had accepted that a woman could preside over military success, parliamentary disputes, and religious conflict. Her style of queenship, based on prudence, moral conviction, and emotional intelligence, provided an alternative model of female rule, one that didn't rely on overt charisma or oratorical brilliance but on resilience, principle, and calculated alliances. This model would later resonate with the reigns of Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth II. Like Anne, Victoria ruled in an age of immense change, oversaw military campaigns and empire expansion, and cultivated a public image centered on domestic virtue and moral rectitude. Victoria's long reign echoed many aspects of Anne's approach, especially the emphasis on family, piety, and national duty. Similarly, Elizabeth II's constitutional monarchy rested on emotional restraint, a strong sense of service, and symbolic continuity, qualities also associated with Anne's reign. Both successors benefited from the gradual erosion of the idea that a queen must constantly prove her legitimacy. Anne's reign helped lay that cultural groundwork by demonstrating that female rule, while distinct in style, was fully capable of meeting the demands of governance. Moreover, Anne's legacy influenced the institutional structures that would support future queens. Her reign contributed to the development of cabinet government and constitutional monarchy, systems that later minimized the risk of gender bias interfering with sovereign authority. The increasing role of ministers and parliament created a framework within which female monarchs could exercise ceremonial and moral leadership without being drawn into the same degree of gendered scrutiny faced by Anne. Anne's queenship highlights the intersection of personal identity and public responsibility in a patriarchal political culture. Her story is not just about a woman in power, it's about how power adapts when held by someone outside the traditional mold, and ruled in a way that reflected her context, her personality, and her limitations. But she left behind a monarchy better suited to constitutional evolution and more open to the idea of female leadership. By governing with conviction, enduring political battles, and making her own decisions however quietly, she carved a place in history that helped shape the path for later queens to rule with both dignity and strength. Queen Anne's inability to produce a surviving heir after 17 pregnancies brought the Stuart dynasty to an abrupt end. Her only son, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, died in 1700 at the age of 11, an event that catalyzed the crisis that would define her legacy. With no direct heir, the traditional rules of primogeniture offered no clear Protestant successor, and the prospect of a Catholic claimant, James Francis Edward Stuart, known as the Old Pretender, loomed large. His candidacy posed a serious threat. A return of the Catholic Stuarts could undo the religious and constitutional settlement brought by the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Parliament, anxious to avoid a return to dynastic instability and Catholic monarchy, turned to legislative means to secure the succession and to subtly reshape the monarchy itself. The Act of Settlement was Parliament's crowning response. It stipulated that if Anne died without Protestant heirs, the crown would pass to Sophia of Hanover, granddaughter of James I, and her Protestant descendants. Catholics and those marrying Catholics were explicitly barred. Moreover, the act imposed constitutional constraints on the monarchy. Monarchs could not leave Britain or declare war without parliamentary consent. Judges were given tenure during good behavior, binding them to judiciary independence, and office holders could not sit in Commons, delineating clear separation between Crown and Parliament. By implementing these provisions, Parliament reinforced Protestant succession and advanced the authority of Parliament over monarchical prerogative. The Act's implications extended to Scotland as well. Under the newly negotiated union, its terms were applied across the United Kingdom, ensuring a singular Protestant monarchy and parliamentary order. However, Scottish resistance persisted. In 1704, Edinburgh passed the Act of Security, asserting its right to choose a different successor unless England conceded to trade and religious terms. England's retaliatory Alien Act forced Scotland back to negotiating union and ultimately accepting the Hanoverian succession. When Queen Anne died, Sophia had predeceased her by a few weeks, but the Act of Settlement directed the crown to pass not to closer Stuart heirs, most of whom were Catholic, but to Sophia's eldest son. Thus, George Louis, Elector of Hanover, ascended as King George I of Great Britain. His accession inaugurated the Hanoverian dynasty, overcoming more than 50 closer but Catholic Stuart claimants. This dynastic shift, backed by law, not bloodline, signified Parliament's supremacy. It irreversibly thwarted the Catholic Stuarts and anchored the monarchy firmly in Protestant constitutionalism. The consequences were profound and enduring. First, it institutionalized religious continuity. All future monarchs were required to be in communion with the Church of England and barred from Catholicism or union with Catholics, principles that remain, albeit revised, in modern succession law. Second, by affirming that war, foreign travel, and judicial appointments required parliamentary consent, the Act further shifted real power to Parliament. It underpinned a constitutional monarchy with separation of powers, judicial independence, and a parliamentary check on the crown. George I's consent initiated a period of dynastic stability. Though politically inexperienced in Britain, he spoke no English and spent early years governing from Hanover. He accepted his role under the constitutional limits Parliament had established. His reign saw the solidification of cabinet government, with ministers drawn from and accountable to Parliament, not the monarch alone. Moreover, the personal union with Hanover seeded enduring British-German ties. The Hanoverian monarchs continued to rule both Britain and Hanover, blending continental and British interests. While initially unpopular, many saw George I as a foreign figure. His government enacted laws barring the monarch from granting foreign land or engaging in war without parliamentary approval, thereby limiting any pull toward Hanover. Despite George II and III increasingly British in identity, the legacy of dual monarchy lingered, affecting foreign policy and shaping British diplomatic posture on the continent. On the broader European stage, the Hanoverian succession emphasized dynastic law over hereditary proximity and religion over blood in determining rulers. It marked a shift from divine monarchy to parliamentary sovereignty. France and supporters of the Stuarts continued to back Jacobite claimants, but successive failed rebellions, both politically and militarily underpinned by Parliament-backed Hanoverian rule, ensured the Protestant constitutional monarchy stayed intact. Britain thus emerged as a constitutional state whose legitimacy derived from law and parliamentary endorsement, rather than divine or hereditary right alone. The long-term stability achieved through Hanoverian succession influenced other European monarchies by showcasing how religious settlement and legislative determination could avert civil strife. Britain's experiment demonstrated that constitutions can reconcile dynastic complexities with national identity, and that foreign subjects or rulers, if subject to domestic law, can be legitimate sovereigns. These lessons echoed across the 18th and 19th centuries as European countries balanced constitutionalism with dynastic tradition. Queen Anne's failure to leave a living heir and the enforced Protestant succession marked the closure of the Stuart era and the birth of the Hanoverian dynasty. Parliament's decisive application of the Act of Settlement and the peaceful succession of George I underlined the supremacy of legislative authority over monarchical authority. This transition delivered religious continuity, constitutional clarity, ministerial government, and a stable Protestant monarchy anchored in law. It also reinforced British-German connections and projected a model of constitutional dynastic succession influential across Europe. The Hanoverian legacy shaped Britain's path toward modern constitutional monarchy and influenced the broader narrative of European statecraft. Queen Anne's reign marked a significant turning point for the British Empire, laying essential groundwork for its expansion into a global empire. Her policies not only strengthened Britain at home but also reinforced its commercial, cultural, and legal influence across the Atlantic world, setting the stage for imperial dominance in the 18th and 19th centuries. The reign coincided with key military and political gains that would underpin empire building. Victories during the War of the Spanish Succession, particularly under the Treaty of Utrecht, secured crucial territorial expansion in North America and strategic naval bases in Europe. These new acquisitions served as launching pads for further trade and settlement. Moreover, Anne's support for a unified British state through the Acts of Union ensured coordinated policy-making and defense. By forging Great Britain as a political and economic entity, she strengthened the nation's capacity to pursue imperial ambitions with coherence and purpose. Underlying this expansion was the mercantilist economic theory that dominated state policy. Britain embraced protective tariffs, navigational laws, and colonial monopolies. These policies mandated that colonies trade primarily with the mother country, nurturing Britain's manufacturing and shipping sectors. Anne's government supported companies like the Royal African Company and the Hudson's Bay Company, granting exclusive rights to trade and colonize vast regions overseas. This commercial imperialism fostered an economic ecosystem where profits from slavery, resources, and trade flowed back to Britain, enriching the state and fueling further expansion. Expansion of British trade networks under Anne's reign was dramatic and far-reaching, especially in the Atlantic. Britain's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade grew substantially, as it transported thousands of enslaved Africans to work in Caribbean plantations and emerging economies like those in North America. The plantation system fueled by slave labor produced commodities sugar, tobacco, cotton that became central to British economic growth. The trade in these goods, along with manufactured exports, maritime finance and insurance, created a sophisticated and interdependent Atlantic economy spanning Europe, Africa, and the Americas. These networks connected producers and consumers across continents, enhancing Britain's commercial and naval infrastructure. As Britain expanded, so did the spread of its culture and language. British colonial settlers established English-language newspapers, schools, churches, and civic institutions throughout North America and elsewhere. The Anglican Church was instrumental. Colonial ministers helped standardize religious customs and ecclesiastical structures. Meanwhile, education institutions and literary societies promoted British norms of governance, literacy, and public discourse. The influence of periodicals like The Spectator, though produced in London during Anne's reign, extended to the colonies through birdsong and imported reading culture. Centuries later, English would become the dominant language in these regions, offering common frameworks for legal, political, and cultural life. Perhaps most enduring was the transplantation of Britain's legal and institutional frameworks. Colonies were structured around charters drawn from English common law, introducing courts, jury systems, and property rights to colonial societies. Colonial assemblies emulated the British Parliament, debating taxes and forming proto-democratic practices. Local elites, many educated in Britain or steeped in British law, adopted parliamentary procedures and civic institutions. These traditions endured even after independence, preserving continuities in governance and legal practice. Anne's reign also helped define imperial attitudes. Imperial administrators viewed colonies as subordinate partners in maximizing enterprise, reflected in appointed governors, councils, and bureaucratic systems. Yet colonial elites still asserted local autonomy, shaping a dynamic relationship between center and periphery. This tension between imperial oversight and colonial self-rule would later fuel debates about sovereignty and rights. Military infrastructure also benefited from Anne's reign. With naval bases like Gibraltar and Minorca secured under the Treaty of Utrecht, Britain gained naval supremacy. This allowed protection of trade routes, coastal settlement, and military intervention when needed. These strategic positions helped the empire project power, defend shipping lanes, and deter rivals like France and Spain. Looking ahead, Queen Anne's policies had long-term consequences. Institutionally, mercantilist trade laws and colonial charters were inherited by future governments and formed the scaffolding of the colonial system. Administratively, civil service practices and colonial governance models persisted for decades. Culturally, English as a language and British legal norms became cornerstones of identity and governance across an empire stretching from North America to Australasia. Economically, the Atlantic trade networks and systems established during Anne's reign evolved in scale but preserved their essential character, underpinning Britain's industrial revolution and global economic power. However, this imperial legacy came with contradictions. The growth of slavery, colonial exploitation, and racial hierarchies had devastating consequences for indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans. Colonial settler societies developed complex racial and class structures. These inequities became entwined with the legal and commercial systems Britain exported, leaving legacies of injustice that lasted centuries. Cultural institutions, while promoting literacy and civic frameworks, often reinforced imperial hierarchies and excluded native voices. Nevertheless, Queen Anne's reign set in motion forces that would define the British Empire. Her government combined military conquest, economic nationalism, cultural export, and institutional transplantation. This blend made Britain a global superpower by the 18th century and shaped the rise of modern states, economies, and cultural identities within its colonies. Legal principles, parliamentary institutions, and English usage introduced under and persisted far beyond her reign, informing legal systems, languages, and civic traditions around the world. Queen Anne's legacy in empire building reflects her era's interplay of war, policy, culture, and commerce. The foundations laid during her reign enabled Britain to build an empire that would dominate global affairs for centuries. The structures and values established under her guardianship, mercantilism, colonial administration, legal transplantation, cultural standardization, and naval strength, endured and evolved. Even as British imperialism faded in the 20th century, the echoes of Queen Anne's policies and institutions remained foundational in shaping the modern world. The architectural legacy of Queen Anne's reign, although often underappreciated in the broader public imagination, profoundly influenced urban development in Britain and its colonies. The Queen Anne style, that emerged during and shortly after her rule, is somewhat of a historical misnomer. It reflects not a strict architectural code developed under her direct influence, but rather a composite aesthetic that crystallized during her era and found enduring popularity in the 18th and later 19th centuries. Characterized by its restrained elegance, the Queen Anne style in its original British form was marked by red brick facades, sash windows, dormer roofs, white-painted woodwork, and classical symmetry. These homes often displayed modest decorative features, eschewing the overt grandeur of earlier Baroque expressions. The emphasis on proportion, refinement, and domestic comfort reflected both the cultural sensibilities of the early 18th century and the growing influence of the urban middle class. Following the Great Fire of London, the city underwent a transformative period of reconstruction that continued into Queen Anne's reign. Although much of the initial rebuilding was carried out under Charles II and William III, it was under and that this urban renaissance began to assume a coherent architectural identity. The work of Sir Christopher Wren, particularly in rebuilding London's churches and public buildings, was widely influential during this time, laying the groundwork for a more formal and ordered cityscape. By Anne's reign, urban development was becoming more systematic, with streets planned for both aesthetic effect and utility. Townhouses for aristocrats and affluent merchants in areas like Bloomsbury and Kensington helped introduce regularized street layouts, a hallmark of early modern urban planning. Public spaces, squares, and promenades emerged as social and cultural centers, embodying the era's vision of civic order and elegance. This architectural and urban vision did not remain confined to Britain. Across the Atlantic, the colonies adopted and adapted the Queen Anne style in constructing their own civic and domestic buildings. In colonial America, Queen Anne elements were particularly visible in affluent homes in places like Williamsburg, Charleston, and Boston. American adaptations retained the symmetry and brick construction of the British model but often incorporated local materials and simpler layouts, resulting in a hybridized vernacular that combined Georgian and Queen Anne influences. Features such as gambrel roofs, paneled interiors, and gabled dormers became staples of the colonial architectural lexicon, bridging British stylistic heritage with New World pragmatism. The urban design sensibilities that matured during Anne's reign also shaped broader trends in city development. The idea of planning with long-term civic goals in mind rather than reacting to disasters began to take root. Ideas of regulated building codes, organized street grids, and integration of public squares had long-term ramifications in cities across Britain and the Empire. Over time, these principles would evolve into comprehensive urban planning theories that informed the designs of Victorian towns, imperial capitals, and even modern suburban developments. Despite her architectural and civic legacy, Queen Anne's personal presence in the collective memory has historically been faint. For centuries she was viewed as a transitional monarch, overshadowed by the more flamboyant Elizabeth I or the revolutionary changes under George III. However, recent cultural and academic efforts have sparked a reappraisal of her reign, highlighting her contributions in governance, religion, and cultural patronage. One of the most notable examples of Anne's resurgence in public imagination came with the release of the 2018 film The Favourite, directed by Yorgos Lanthimos. Portrayed by Olivia Colman in an Oscar-winning performance, Queen Anne was depicted not merely as a passive figurehead but as a complex, emotionally layered monarch grappling with the burdens of power, health, and personal relationships. The film, while dramatized, catalyzed renewed interest in Anne's life and reign, sparking both public curiosity and scholarly debate. For many, it presented a monarch rarely given center stage, offering a lens through which to re-examine her achievements, her struggles with infertility and gout, her relationships with Sarah Churchill and Abigail Massom, and her crucial role in the transition from Stuart to Hanoverian rule. Though not strictly historical in its details, The Favourite succeeded in humanizing and introducing her to a generation that may otherwise have known little about her. Literature, too, has played a role in reshaping Anne's image. Historical novels, biographies, and academic reassessments have painted a more nuanced portrait of a monarch who, despite personal challenges and limited power compared to her predecessors, helped preside over a formative era in British history. Historians now emphasize her support for the Acts of Union, her role in the War of the Spanish Succession, and her influence on the constitutional balance between monarchy and parliament. This re-evaluation has moved her away from the shadows of historical obscurity and into a more central role in narratives of early modern Britain. In terms of national identity and heritage, Queen Anne's image has found a more reserved but nonetheless persistent presence. While she lacks the mythic grandeur of Elizabeth I or Victoria, and has come to symbolize a critical bridge between the medieval and modern British states. In civic architecture and institutions, her name endures. Queen Anne's Gate in Westminster, Queen Anne-style houses in American suburbs, and institutions bearing her name across the former empire all testify to the legacy she left behind. In modern Britain, her reign is increasingly recognized as foundational in shaping not only a unified kingdom but also a constitutional framework and cultural identity that has endured for centuries. Queen Anne's architectural legacy, urban planning influence, and cultural rehabilitation in media and scholarship reveal a monarch whose contributions were once understated but are now being given their due. Her era gave birth to aesthetic, structural, and institutional innovations that influenced not just London or Britain, but an entire imperial and post-imperial world. Meanwhile, her complex personal narrative recently brought to vivid life through film and literature invites ongoing reflection on the ways history remembers its most quietly consequential figures. Queen Anne's reign played a pivotal role in shaping legal and political systems that still exert influence in the modern world. Though not revolutionary in the way that some later monarchs or parliaments would be, her era marked a significant shift in how power was understood, exercised, and distributed within the British state. The legal and constitutional changes and precedents that either emerged or solidified during her time helped institutionalize the British constitutional monarchy and laid crucial groundwork for both British and American political development. One of the key developments of Queen Anne's reign was the reinforcement of statutory and constitutional precedents that would come to define parliamentary democracy and the limitations of royal authority. While the Glorious Revolution had already curtailed absolutist monarchy, the years following including Anne's reign were essential for embedding those changes into lasting practice. The Bill of Rights, though enacted before her reign, came to life during her time as queen. It established the supremacy of Parliament over the Crown in matters of legislation, taxation, and the right to petition. These principles were no longer mere theoretical constructs, they were enforced and respected during Anne's governance, setting a precedent for how a constitutional monarch should behave. Her acceptance of these constraints and her governance within them made her reign a model for the rule of law, where monarchy coexisted with a sovereign legislature. Queen Anne also presided over an era when Parliament began to demonstrate increasing independence and sovereignty. This was visible not only in its ability to draft and pass legislation without royal interference but also in the way it structured political power. For example, Anne's occasional conflicts with the Whigs and Tories, two evolving political factions, reflected Parliament's growing autonomy. Ministers such as Robert Harley and Sidney Godolphin became key political actors not because the monarch willed it, but because they commanded parliamentary support. This emerging ministerial responsibility laid the groundwork for later practices where executive power was contingent upon the confidence of the legislature. Parliament's assertion of authority also manifested in its handling of issues such as succession and union. The Act of Settlement, which ensured that only Protestant heirs could ascend the throne, demonstrated Parliament's ultimate control over monarchical succession. Queen Anne, though a Stuart and closely tied to the previous Catholic sympathetic monarch James II, fully accepted this act and governed in accordance with its terms. This not only preserved Protestant constitutionalism but also showed the monarch's increasing subordination to statutory law. Similarly, the Acts of Union between England and Scotland were largely driven by political necessity and parliamentary negotiation, with Anne playing a supporting and symbolic role rather than dominating the legislative process. Her ability to guide rather than impose solutions became a hallmark of the constitutional monarchy in practice. Another lasting aspect of Anne's reign was the evolution of cabinet government and the role of ministers, which provided the functional framework for modern parliamentary democracy. Although the cabinet was still informal and the prime minister role did not yet officially exist, Anne's reliance on senior ministers who coordinated policy and communicated with Parliament hinted at the emerging executive-legislative relationship. Over time, this development matured into a system where the monarch reigned but did not rule, one in which real power was vested in elected representatives and their chosen executives. Queen Anne's limited, but still meaningful, political involvement, such as in the War of the Spanish Succession and the management of the Union, illustrated the changing nature of the Crown's role in governance. The monarch remained a central figure in diplomacy, military affairs, and state ceremony, but had to work within a tightly bounded legal and political framework. The constitutional principles that solidified under and had a significant transatlantic influence, particularly on the formation of American constitutional thought. The American colonies, already familiar with British legal traditions and parliamentary institutions, observed Anne's government as a functioning model of limited monarchy and representative governance. Colonial assemblies were structured in part on British parliamentary norms: bicameralism, procedural debate, and legislation based on consent. The American founders would later draw directly from these experiences and the British example when designing their own constitution. One of the most visible impacts of Anne's era on American constitutional development was the idea of checks and balances. While the British system did not employ the term in the modern sense, the tensions and balancing acts between Crown, Parliament, and ministers during Anne's reign illustrated a functioning system where no branch held absolute power. This interplay, visible in episodes such as Anne's dissolution of Parliament or her tensions with the Whig junto, modeled a political culture where institutional friction was not only tolerated but essential to governance. American thinkers like John Adams and James Madison looked to this tradition when constructing a government that would restrain both executive overreach and legislative tyranny. Another direct influence from Anne's reign was the respect for statutory law and the idea that constitutionalism could exist without a written constitution. The British system's reliance on precedent, evolving statutes, and parliamentary sovereignty became the intellectual forerunner of common law-based legal systems across the Anglophone world. The emphasis on tradition, interpretive flexibility, and case law would come to define legal practices not just in Britain but in Canada, Australia, India, and the United States. Even in their revolutionary break from Britain, the American colonies retained the foundational legal assumptions that had been normalized under Anne. Queen Anne's legacy in legal and political systems is therefore not one of radical innovation but of essential consolidation. Her reign showed that a monarch could operate under defined constitutional constraints, that Parliament could legislate with real authority, and that ministers could serve as intermediaries between sovereign and state. These dynamics created a durable system of governance that would be emulated and adapted in various global contexts. The rise of ministerial responsibility, the entrenchment of statutory authority, the principle of religious exclusion in political succession, and the gradual shift toward a ceremonial monarchy all originated or matured during Anne's time. Queen Anne's influence on modern legal and political systems is both foundational and far-reaching. Through her reign, principles of parliamentary sovereignty, ministerial accountability, and constitutional monarchy moved from theory to practice. Her government became a living example of how power could be balanced between institutions without descending into chaos or tyranny. This legacy not only stabilized Britain during a critical period of transition but also provided enduring templates for governance that would shape constitutional democracies around the world. When examining the legacies of British monarchs, certain figures stand out in popular consciousness. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen who defeated the Spanish Armada and fostered a golden age of exploration and literature. Queen Victoria, the long-reigning symbol of imperial grandeur and moral rectitude, and Queen Elizabeth II, whose recent reign represented continuity and adaptation in a rapidly changing world. In contrast, Queen Anne is often left in the margins of historical memory. Her reign, bracketed by dramatic events and formidable personalities, tends to be overlooked. Yet when measured by institutional impact, geopolitical change, and cultural influence, Queen Anne's legacy deserves a far more central place in discussions of how Britain, and by extension the modern world, was shaped. Elizabeth I ruled during the late 16th and early 17th centuries, establishing Protestantism as the national faith and presiding over a flowering of English culture and maritime power. She is celebrated for her charisma, political acumen, and symbolic stature as the mother of the nation. Yet, institutional development during her time remained constrained by medieval structures. While Parliament existed and wielded some influence, it was largely subordinate to the monarch's will. The Tudor monarchy maintained a relatively personal style of rule, where court politics and royal favor dictated the terms of governance. Elizabeth's legacy, while significant in cultural and nationalistic terms, did not fundamentally alter the architecture of the British state. Queen Victoria's reign coincided with industrialization, empire building, and the consolidation of parliamentary democracy. While her influence was largely symbolic, real power had shifted to Parliament and the Prime Minister. She represented a stable monarchy at a time of rapid social and technological change. Under her watch, the British Empire reached its territorial peak, and the monarchy became associated with domestic virtue and imperial destiny. Victoria benefited from the reforms initiated in earlier centuries, including those that matured during Anne's reign, yet her historical stature far surpasses the actual power she exercised. Her image as a unifying figure, combined with the might of Britain's global reach during her reign, cements her place in history. Elizabeth II, similarly, presided over a largely ceremonial monarchy, albeit with extraordinary duration and global visibility. Her reign was marked by decolonization, the Cold War, and the digital revolution, and her role was to personify the continuity of British institutions. Like Victoria, her influence was indirect. She did not shape policy or restructure government, but rather served as a cultural and symbolic touchstone. Elizabeth II's reputation rests on her steadiness and dignity, which helped sustain the monarchy's relevance in the modern world, even as its actual authority continued to wane. Queen Anne's reign was a transitional period in which constitutional monarchy, party politics, union with Scotland, and British imperial ascendancy took definable and institutional form. Unlike Elizabeth I, Anne ruled at a time when the balance of power was shifting decisively away from the monarch and toward Parliament. Unlike Victoria or Elizabeth II, Anne still wielded considerable executive authority and played a critical role in policy decisions, ministerial appointments, and international alliances. She governed during one of the most formative periods in British political history, when the principles of modern parliamentary democracy were being embedded. The Act of Union, which created the Kingdom of Great Britain, occurred under Anne's leadership. She played a key part in fostering the political conditions for unification, navigating a contentious environment that required diplomacy, patience, and foresight. The unification of England and Scotland was not merely a symbolic gesture. It had profound consequences for governance, identity, and geopolitical reach. While Elizabeth I faced the threat of a divided Britain and did little to resolve it, and presided over the legal and political act that bound two previously separate kingdoms into one. Anne's reign also saw the evolution of cabinet government and the firm establishment of ministerial responsibility. While she did not create these systems outright, she governed during their early formation. Her dealings with ministers like Sidney Godolphin and Robert Harley highlight the emerging dynamic in which executive power was mediated through Parliament and dependent on political support. This was a departure from the monarchical absolutism of earlier periods and a move toward the kind of constitutional monarchy that would define Britain in the centuries to come. Yet Anne's legacy is routinely overshadowed. She lacked the dramatic flair of Elizabeth I, the imperial sweep of Victoria, or the media age visibility of Elizabeth II. Physically ailing, often politically cautious and devoid of direct heirs, and did not project the kind of personal mythology that tends to enshrine monarchs in national memory. Furthermore, the intellectual and political contributions of her reign are often attributed to others, her ministers, generals like the Duke of Marlborough, or Parliament itself, rather than being understood as collaborative outcomes shaped under her leadership. This oversight may also stem from the gendered dynamics of history writing. Like other female monarchs, Anne's role was often interpreted through the lens of her personal relationships and emotional life. Her friendships with Sarah Churchill and Abigail Massam were the subject of court gossip and, more recently, popular films, but the political acuity she demonstrated in navigating factional rivalries has rarely received equivalent attention. Moreover, her religious devotion, which shaped both her domestic and foreign policy decisions, is often reduced to piety rather than recognized as a coherent political vision rooted in Protestant constitutionalism. Yet the structures that matured under her, such as the regularization of party politics, the increasing professionalism of governance, and Britain's emergence as a global power, were defining features of the modern age. Her support for the War of the Spanish Succession placed Britain on a path toward maritime and imperial dominance. The Treaty of Utrecht, negotiated during her reign, secured strategic gains such as Gibraltar and Newfoundland, setting the stage for Britain's future as a world empire. Moreover, Anne's reign offers critical insight into how institutions evolve not through dramatic rupture, but through gradual consolidation and adaptation. She exemplifies the kind of monarch who shepherds rather than transforms, whose importance lies not in grand gestures but in fostering continuity through complexity. Her governance occurred at the intersection of monarchy, parliament, and a rapidly globalizing world. In this sense, she provides a model of constitutional development that remains highly relevant, especially as modern democracies continue to navigate the balance between tradition and change. While Anne lacks the iconic status of Elizabeth I, Victoria, or Elizabeth II, her reign was arguably more consequential in shaping the institutional foundations of the modern British state. Her rule witnessed the crystallization of constitutional monarchy, the union of nations, the rise of party politics, and the early stirrings of British imperial power. These legacies, often overlooked in favor of more charismatic or visible monarchs, are foundational to the world we live in today. Anne's reign deserves more attention not because it dazzled with spectacle, but because it structured the modern age through careful, measured, and often underappreciated governance. Queen Anne's reign marked one of the most consequential periods in British and global history, though her legacy has often been eclipsed by more dramatic or charismatic monarchs. As the last of the Stuarts and the first monarch of a unified Great Britain, and governed at a time when the modern state was beginning to take recognizable shape, her influence, often exercised quietly and through collaboration with ministers, generals, and parliament, helped usher in transformative changes that would resonate far beyond her relatively short 12-year reign. The union of England and Scotland, the foundations of the British Empire through territorial gains and military success, and the solidification of constitutional monarchy collectively define the enduring significance of her rule. The Act of Union was perhaps the most defining moment of Anne's reign, creating a single political entity known as Great Britain. This was not merely an administrative adjustment but a redefinition of national identity, law, and governance. It resolved centuries of intermittent conflict and competition between England and Scotland and set the foundation for a united state capable of projecting power on a global scale. Queen Anne was instrumental in facilitating this process. While the legislation was passed by Parliament, Anne's persistent advocacy, personal diplomacy, and ability to maintain balance between conflicting interests were critical. The Union transformed internal British politics and enabled the country to act with a unified voice in international affairs, a capability that would be central to its imperial rise. Anne's reign also coincided with the War of the Spanish Succession, a complex continental conflict that resulted in Britain's emergence as a major global power. The war, fought alongside the Grand Alliance to prevent a Franco-Spanish hegemony in Europe, culminated in British military triumphs under the Duke of Marlborough and diplomatic successes such as the Treaty of Utrecht. The outcomes of this treaty had long-term imperial consequences. Britain gained Gibraltar, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, Hudson Bay Territory, and commercial privileges in the Americas and the Caribbean. These gains not only boosted the British economy but also marked the beginning of sustained maritime and colonial expansion. The roots of the British Empire as a naval and trade-based global force can be directly traced to Anne's wartime leadership and the negotiations that followed. Equally transformative was the political evolution that occurred under Anne's reign. This was a period when the balance of power shifted decisively from the monarchy to Parliament. While earlier monarchs had fought this shift and governed within it, allowing constitutional practices to solidify, her working relationships with powerful ministers, and her navigation of emerging party dynamics between the Whigs and Tories, helped stabilize the state in a time of institutional redefinition. Although she often had strong personal preferences, she ultimately deferred to the realities of parliamentary supremacy, helping to establish a precedent of limited monarchy and ministerial responsibility. This new political order would later evolve into the modern parliamentary democracy seen in the United Kingdom today. These core legacies, the Union, the Empire, and the Constitution, are not only significant in British history but also shaped the development of the wider Anglosphere. The political and legal traditions that were affirmed or established during Anne's rule would take root in British colonies and dominions, influencing the constitutional frameworks of countries like the United States, Canada, Australia, and India. The emphasis on parliamentary sovereignty, checks on executive power, and rule of law became cornerstones of liberal democratic governance worldwide. Moreover, the institutional stability achieved under and laid the groundwork for the relatively peaceful succession of the Hanoverian dynasty, ensuring Protestant continuity and contributing to a century of political evolution rather than revolution. Despite these monumental achievements, Queen Anne's legacy has often been underappreciated. This is partly due to her reserved personality and the lack of personal mythology that surrounds figures like Elizabeth I or Queen Victoria. Anne was physically frail, politically cautious, and ultimately left no direct heirs, which may have contributed to her marginalization in popular memory. Furthermore, much of the success of her reign is credited to others, her generals, ministers, and parliament, obscuring the crucial role she played in managing, guiding, and legitimizing these actors within the broader constitutional framework. Yet, governance is rarely the work of a single individual. It is the ability to collaborate, to arbitrate conflicting interests, and to uphold emerging norms that often defines effective leadership. And did all of these, often without fanfare, and in doing so shape the structures of modern governance. The need to re-evaluate Anne's impact is therefore not merely a matter of historical justice but also of understanding the true origins of the modern state and international order. Her reign offers insight into how meaningful change can occur not through spectacle but through institution building, legal precedent, and strategic diplomacy. In many ways, Anne was the architect of a Britain that could compete on the world stage, govern through representative institutions, and balance the demands of diverse national interests. Her leadership style, rooted in pragmatism, religious conviction, and constitutional restraint, provides a model of statecraft that is highly relevant in today's increasingly complex political landscapes. Queen Anne's global legacy is most clearly visible in the Anglosphere, a community of nations linked not only by language and culture but also by shared political traditions that originated during her reign. The spread of British constitutional principles, common law, and parliamentary democracy across continents can be traced to the institutional foundations. Her role in initiating this diffusion was foundational, even if it has not been widely acknowledged. Without her reign, the Act of Union might have failed, Britain's imperial position might have faltered, and the development of constitutional monarchy could have taken a far more turbulent path. Queen Anne deserves recognition not as a footnote between more glamorous monarchs but as a pivotal figure in world history. Her reign encapsulated a rare convergence of union building, war leadership, political stabilization, and constitutional evolution. These accomplishments did not merely define an era, they launched a new trajectory for Britain and its global descendants. She did not rule with grandiloquence or militaristic audacity, but with constitutional sensibility, strategic vision, and institutional awareness. Queen Anne, though often forgotten, stands as one of the true architects of the modern Anglosphere and a monarch whose influence quietly but profoundly helped shape the world we live in today.